There is something a comedian learns only once, and only in a room where nobody is waiting for them. Katt Williams learned it on a night most people have never heard about, in front of an audience that had come to see someone else entirely. The night didn't look significant from the outside. It was, by almost every visible measure, the opposite of the shows that get remembered and discussed and written about. Not a recording, not a major venue, not a night that anyone on the production side had flagged as anything other than a standard booking in a room that held a few hundred people on a good night. The headliner was someone the audience knew. The crowd had arranged their evening around that name, not the name that appeared before it on the bill. And the name that appeared before it, the opener, the warm-up, the performer whose job was to get the room ready for whoever came next, was Katt Williams. At some point in the mid-2000s, when his name was already appearing on marquees, when his specials were already in circulation, when other comedians had already begun to speak about him in the way comedians speak about someone they recognize as working at a different level than everyone else, Katt Williams took an opening slot in a room that had no particular reason to care who he was. Why he took it is a question that the people who knew him during this period have answered in different ways. Some have said it was a favor, a booking that came together last minute through a connection that made it difficult to decline. Others have said it was more deliberate than that he occasionally, throughout his career, sought out situations where the usual conditions of his performances didn't apply, where the crowd wasn't pre-sold, where the goodwill wasn't built in, where nothing about the room had been arranged in his favor in advance. Whatever the reason, the result was the same. On a night that looked from the outside like a minor engagement on a calendar full of larger ones, Katt Williams walked into a room where his name meant nothing to the people sitting in it. To understand what that meant, it helps to understand how a comedy show structured around an opener and a headliner actually functioned during this period, and what it felt like to occupy the opener's position. The architecture of a billed comedy show in the mid-2000s operated on a hierarchy that was visible to everyone in the room, even when nobody said anything about it out loud. The headliner's name was on the poster. The headliner's name was what the audience had told their friends when they mentioned they were going. The headliner's name was what the venue's social currency, whatever goodwill, anticipation, and excited conversation preceded the show, was built around. By the time the lights went down and the evening began, the emotional contract between the audience and the night had already been established, and the headliner was the person that contract was written for. The opener existed outside of that contract. Not hostilely, audiences weren't waiting for the opener to fail, weren't actively indifferent in any way that felt personal. It was simpler and more neutral than that. The opener simply wasn't who they had come for, which meant that everything the opener did on stage they had to do without any of the built-in momentum that a headliner arrived with. No goodwill, no anticipation, no collective excitement that had been building since the night was announced. Just a room of people in their seats, drinks in hand, waiting for the evening to become the thing they had paid for, and, in the meantime, giving a portion of their attention to a performer they might never have thought about before, and might never think about again. For a comedian with an established reputation, that situation produced a specific kind of discomfort. The audience wasn't hostile, but they also weren't particularly interested. Their attention was available. They were in their seats. They were present. But it was available the way any waiting time is available. Loosely, without investment, without the kind of forward lean that an audience brings to a performer they've been anticipating. To earn that attention fully, to move a room from polite availability to genuine engagement, required building something from zero, in front of people who had come expecting to spend their emotional energy elsewhere. Most established comedians, given the choice, avoided exactly this situation. The economics of a mid-career booking made it easy to avoid. There was no reason, at a certain level of recognition, to take an opener slot. The money wasn't there. The exposure didn't add much, and the asymmetry between what the room was offering and what a more prominent billing could provide made the whole arrangement seem irrational. The only reason to take it was if something about the situation itself had value. If there was something the room could give that a better position booking couldn't. Katt Williams understood something about rooms like this one that most comedians at his level had moved past the opportunity to learn. A room that owes you nothing is the only room that tells you the truth. When an audience arrives pre-sold, already invested in who you are and what your work is meant to them, their laughter and their attention carry something extra that has nothing to do with what you're doing at the microphone that night. They've decided before the show begins that they're going to enjoy themselves, which means that the feedback a comedian receives in a room like that is accurate, but it's accurate about a performance that has been shaped at every step by a room that was already on your side. A room where nobody knows your name operates on different terms. The feedback that comes back from an indifferent audience is harder and more honest than almost anything a room full of fans can produce. A joke that lands in a room that doesn't care about you has landed on its own, not because of reputation, not because the crowd came ready to laugh, but because the writing and the timing and the delivery were enough to break through the baseline of polite disengagement and produce a genuine response. Which means you know, in a room like this, that what worked actually worked, not because the room was generous, but because the work was strong enough to earn it. He stepped onto that stage carrying none of the things that usually arrived with him. No recognition when his name was announced, a smattering of applause, polite, disconnected from any particular feeling. No anticipatory lean from the front rows. No sense as he walked to the microphone that the room was moving toward him. The audience was comfortable, settled into the evening, present but elsewhere in some fundamental way. They were waiting. He was, for the moment, simply a voice in the way of what they were waiting for. For the first few minutes, the room was exactly what it looked like. Occupied but not engaged, present but not invested. The laughs came in the way laughs come from an audience that hasn't decided yet, not withheld but not committed. The kind of response that tells a performer that the door is still open without quite inviting them through it. It was a particular kind of pressure, and it produced a particular kind of clarity. There were no shortcuts available. There was no accumulated goodwill to spend. There was only the material, the timing, and the room's honest response to both. What shifted, and when, and over how many minutes, is the kind of thing that is difficult to describe precisely because it happens gradually and then all at once. Somewhere in the middle of the set, the quality of the attention in the room changed. Not dramatically. Rooms don't shift in a way that's audible to everyone simultaneously. It happened the way it always happens. One section of the audience leaned forward slightly, and then another section caught what they were responding to, and the energy that had been loose and scattered began to concentrate. By the time it was visible as a change in the room, it had already been building for several minutes, quietly, without announcement, simply because the material had been working on a crowd that wasn't inclined to give it anything it hadn't earned. By the end of the set, the room was different than it had been at the beginning. Not transformed, not converted in any dramatic sense. The audience still knew who they had come for, but the laughter had changed in character. The attention was real in a way it hadn't been at the start, and the applause when he walked off the stage carried something that hadn't been in the room when he walked on. Not recognition of who he was, but recognition of what had just happened. The headliner that night, by most accounts, performed well. The show ran the way these shows ran, and the audience went home with what they had come for. But in the days and weeks after that night, the thing people who had been in that building talked about most wasn't the headliner's set. It was the opener, a performer whose name several of them had to look up afterward because they hadn't caught it when it was announced and hadn't thought to memorize it before the evening was over. What that night gave Katt Williams wasn't anything he could put in a set or explain in an interview. It was something more internal than that, a confirmation of a specific kind, that the work held up when nothing else was holding it up, that the material was strong enough to earn its own room, in a room that wasn't his. That the voice he had built in years of small rooms where audiences weren't necessarily there for him either was still capable of starting from zero and arriving somewhere real by the end. In the larger story of his career, the specials, the arena shows, the television appearances, a night like this one leaves almost no trace. There's no recording, no review, no documented evidence that it happened the way the people who were there remember it happening. It exists, if it exists anywhere, in the memories of a few hundred people who came to see someone else and left thinking about someone they hadn't expected to think about at all. But for the people who understand what a room like that actually tests, what it asks of a performer and what it reveals about the work, that night tells a story about Katt Williams that none of the bigger nights quite can. Not the story of a comedian filling arenas or recording specials that millions of people would watch. The story of a comedian who, at a moment when he had every reason not to, walked into a room that owed him nothing and found out, one more time, that the work was enough. That's the part of the story most people never heard. Not the specials, not the sold-out shows, not the performances built around rooms that were already his before he said a word. A few hundred people, a room with no goodwill to spare, and the night Katt Williams learned the only thing a career full of bigger rooms could never teach him.